to Makers and Movers, where we unveil the extraordinary journeys of leaders in manufacturing. I'm Andrea Hoffer, your host for this podcast. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with David Krakoff, who has been CEO of many manufacturing ventures, both domestically and internationally. So we'll have the pleasure of hearing about his projects and his leadership styles as he has gone through these ventures. So David, welcome to the podcast.
Well, hi, Andrea. Nice to be here.
Well, thank you. So could you just start out by sharing with us a little bit of how you got into manufacturing and take us through your journey? Tell us about some of the projects you've worked on.
Sure. Well, it's been kind of an unusual career, but I've been very fortunate. So I guess for about the last 30 years, I've worked for several world-class global manufacturers, mostly in what I call the broadly defined building material space. And I've really done things from floor to ceiling. So I've done structural products, things that you don't see in a house or a building, things like aluminum or the wire and cable. I've done engineered products that would include things like residential and commercial appliances or plumbing fixtures and fittings. And then I've done decorative products, and that would include things like flooring, textiles, and wall covering. So residential and commercial, pretty much floor to ceiling. And I'm lucky. Most of the companies that I've worked for have been the largest in the world at what they do,
Mm.
the most profitable in the world at what they do. So it was a terrific way to learn business. And they sent me all over the world. So I think I can say without fear of being wrong that I've done business on every continent where business is done.
Well, great. Well, I want to hear about your leadership style. How do you lead your team, engage your team? And then we're going to dive a little bit into the different ways you've had to lead as you work internationally with all the different types of cultures.
Yeah, well, that's been kind of an interesting story too. So I up at a time in business where leadership styles were very autocratic, very siloed. Um, People told you what to do. You said, yes, sir, and off you went to do it. That's not my style at all. I have a very collegial, very collaborative style. I have a strong personality. And it's easy sometimes, I guess, for people to feel a little bit intimidated. So the first thing that I do with groups that I manage is I say, listen, when we get into the conference room, I'm just another voice around the table. If I didn't want to know what you think, I wouldn't invite you to the meeting because I already know what I think. So it's okay to challenge me. It's okay to say, David, that might not have been the smartest thing you ever said. And let's get into it. I'm not married to the final decision being my decision. I just want it to be the best decision. And I really enjoy it when we get in the conference room and have a little give and take and push back and forth. As a result of that, I think over the last decades, I've been able to train other real strong leaders who are secure in their leadership, able to take criticism, and understand that even when you're at the very top, you still have to defend your thinking and your thoughts and ideas so they make sense. Um, and that's pretty much my style.
I love it. It engages people. It helps them to learn and to be their own leader and maybe question some of their ideas as well. As well as learning from others. So tell us about some of the different countries that you have worked with and how that leadership style has come up across different cultures.
Well, I began my corporate career working for a really large European company, a Swedish company, AB Electrolux, with whom I'm sure you're familiar. And at the time, Electrolux was the largest manufacturer of appliances in the world, also a pretty big manufacturer of vacuum cleaners. But we did residential products, commercial products. It was a very or acquisition oriented company. We owned over 100 brand names all over the world. And part of my job was to develop products that were appropriate for the markets that we would enter, and also to figure out the entrance strategies when we were looking at going into a new country. which gave me a tremendous amount of latitude. So sometimes when you enter a new country, it's as simple as setting up a sales office. Sometimes you do a joint venture, a strategic alliance. Sometimes you do an acquisition. Sometimes you build a factory. And I had all those tools at my disposal. So I had to learn how to do all those things. And I learned how to build factories and hire people in foreign cultures, and negotiate with unions, develop products that met the needs of the consumers in those countries. Most of that work being done in foreign languages. And I'm lucky, I sort of come from a multicultural background. I grew up in a neighborhood full of immigrants. So I speak a few languages, and that's been a big help. But that's how I got started. And I think most of the things that I do today that I think I'm the best at were things that I learned really early in my career, that time at Electrolux.
You said you had to figure some of those things out. How did you do that? Those are some big things to figure
Well,
out, and again, on in a different country.
in in the business world, when you really simplify it, at least in our manufacturing world, there tends to be three kinds of people. There's people who make things, people who sell things, and people who count things. And almost nobody is all three. And if you're lucky, you can teach yourself to be a couple. And that's what I did. So even though I'm not an engineer, I had to learn how to build factories and get things done ahead of schedule and under budget and work with construction crews. And I learned that by basically apprenticing under people in our company who were very, very good at that. Similarly, when I had to learn how to do mergers and acquisitions, I didn't begin as the leader of the team. I began as one of hundreds of people who did that at Electrolux, learned from people who were, well, I always say, I got to learn this from giants. So I was taught by the best, and then developed my own style over the years. Having the ability to speak a few foreign languages was helpful because I could come in and just mesh a little bit easier with people. And then growing up in an area with lots of people, none of whom were from the United States, just it sort of taught me to be comfortable with people who did things differently, thought differently, expressed themselves differently. And you know, the United States is such a big country that a lot of Americans speak English, only know how we do things here. And that can be a challenge when you're going to different parts of the world. Some parts of the world are easier than others, but in general, for me, it was not too difficult to learn how to adapt in the different areas.
What were some of the differences that you saw in pick one of the countries that you worked with, and what were the significant differences you saw in how leadership was expressed, but also how the teams worked together?
Well, I'll tell you one of the most earth-shattering ones for me. So I told you I used to build factories, and for years I worked in the aluminum industry. I worked for Kaiser Aluminum, and we would build huge aluminum smelters all over the world. And when I say huge, these could be like 100 acres under a single roof. And a cheap one might be a $2 billion investment. So you can't put these things just anywhere. When you're working in most countries, that process begins with an environmental impact study or something like that. Years later, as I was into this, we started doing a lot of work in Russia, where strangely enough, they would do all the work, dig the hole, build the factory, and do the environmental impact study last. That was kind of a learning experience. There just wasn't a lot of resistance to putting the plants up. So the environmental impact study was a box you would check, but it really wasn't such a big deal in terms of determining whether you would do it. And from a process point of view, obviously to me, that seemed completely backwards. So that was quite a learning experience. But just learning how to buy and sell or negotiate labor contracts in different countries can be radically different. Some countries have big, strong unions that you work with, other places they don't. Um, when I worked in Mexico, a tremendous amount of union negotiation that I had to do. And there's everything from really big, powerful, massive unions to little local unions, and the way you work with them might be a little bit different. So lots of cultural differences. The other thing is timing. So in the United States, we sort of have a sense of how long it should take to get things done. And when you go to other parts of the world, you might go to Africa or Latin America or Russia, as I mentioned before, people's sense of how long it should take to get things done or how long it actually does take to get things done can be quite different. And you have to build that into your planning.
I remember when I was in grad school, I did in an international business class, and we went over to both South Korea and Japan. And one of the things we learned, especially in Japan, when we had a business meeting, was we needed to bring some sort of gift every time we were meeting with somebody new, and we received a gift at each meeting. And I thought that was interesting, and it was part of their culture. Did you work with any Asian countries? What?
Well, I led the Americas arm of a huge Japanese company for about 11 years. So over here in the States, I was the president for Toto Americas, and I ran all the sales and sales related activities for Toto. Toto was the largest manufacturer of plumbing fixtures and fittings in the world, based in Japan and not based in Tokyo, based in southern Japan, where the culture is a little bit different than Tokyo, very, very industrial. And Toto's about over 100 years old. I was either the first or certainly one of the first foreign officers of the company, and one of the very few non-Japanese subsidiary presidents they ever had. In fact, for a while, I was the only non-Japanese subsidiary president. And the Japanese business culture, as you mentioned, is really different from ours. Um, that really wasn't so difficult because there's a lot about Japanese business culture that I really respect and really appreciate, but sort of learning how to transfer that from yourself personally out through an organization of several hundred people can be different. I'll give you a good example. I ran sales teams all over the world. And here in the United States or in the West, when you're evaluating somebody's sales performance, say you give them a sales goal or a sales target, and at the end of the year, you sit down and the sales rep has maybe hit 97, 98% of the target. Here in the States, you're likely to say, well, pretty good performance, 97, 98%. Now, what are we going to do to make up the 2 or 3% you didn't hit? But it's a very positive discussion. In the Japanese culture, that conversation begins with a statement, something like, you failed. That can be a little harsh to
Yeah.
get used to when you hit 97, 98%. Now, everybody can add and subtract as well as anybody else, but it's just the way you express somebody's performance statistics can be very different depending on the cultures. So, what I tried to be in that situation was a bridge between the Japanese and the way they expressed it, my American team, and the way they were accustomed to hearing it, and trying to sort of show everybody what a little give and take might be. Because both are correct. 97, 98%. It's a pretty good performance, but you actually did fail. So learning how to express that is it's value. It's a valuable leadership lesson.
I can imagine that seems it's challenging even just having that type of conversation in your own culture and the culture you're used to and the language you're used to, but then to add a completely different culture on top of it. I could see how difficult that could be. So,
Well, and you mentioned about people speaking different languages, and that's kind of interesting. So I'll use the Japanese experience as an example, but it's pretty true across the board. So at Toto, we had lots of people who would come every year from Japan, spend time in our subsidiary here in the States, and it would be not uncommon for them to stay 2 or 3 years. Well, when the Japanese would get together in their conference rooms and have meetings, guess what language they would speak in? Japanese, which is what you would expect. But people who were not Japanese, and we spoke 8 languages at our headquarters in the United States, which were in Atlanta. Um, but people who were not Japanese would frequently hear them speaking in Japanese and think, are they talking about me? Are they saying something about me? And of course, they weren't. Just like the Americans would speak English, and you sort of gravitate to the language that you're most comfortable in. But even that's something that you have to teach people every time you hear somebody speaking in another language. Guess what? They're not talking about you, they're just talking amongst themselves. Um, of course, if you pick up some phrases here and there, which is always a good idea to do, you'll learn that that's the case. But it's amazing how many people's first reaction is, are they talking about me?
Out of curiosity, what are the languages that you speak? You mentioned that you speak a few
Well, I
different.
grew up in a neighborhood that was mostly people from Europe. So just on the block where I grew up, we had people who spoke Russian, German, Polish, French, Italian, Hungarian, English, of course, and these were the homes of my friends. So when I would go to visit them, their parents would be speaking whatever was their native language, and you're a child, so you just soak it up, and you really don't think about speaking in a foreign language. You just know that when I'm at Tommy's house, they use this word for that. When I'm at Larry's house, they use a different word for that, and it was really kind of an interesting way to grow up. In fact, I don't think I even realized that I spoke a foreign language until I was maybe in the fifth or sixth grade, and we'd gone to see a movie, and people were speaking in German or something, and they didn't have subtitles, and I understood what was being said, and I sort of realized as I looked around the room that everybody else didn't. So we came home from the movie, and I went into the kitchen, and I asked my mother, "Mom, do I speak a foreign language?" And she got a big smile, and she said, well, actually, you speak several. I said, well, really? Which ones do I speak? And she said, well, you speak some German, some Polish, some French, some Italian. Who knew? And if you had told me when I was in high school that speaking foreign languages would do for my career what it's done, I would have thought you were crazy. And yet here I am.
As big as the world seems, it really isn't that big, and it seems to get smaller and smaller. It, with all the technology that we have, and being able to communicate in different languages across different cultures and different countries, I can see even back then of how that would be such a strong skill for you, something that would really help you. So how did you choose manufacturing?
Oh,
What
I guess I kind of just drifted into it. Strangely enough, when I was in college, I majored in political science, and not just political science. I majored in political theory or philosophy. So you would Socrates and Hobbes and Locke and Plato and things like Marx and things like that. So when I graduated from college, I was perfectly qualified to live in the 12th century. That's just the way it was. On the other hand, I really learned how to think analytically, and that was really the skill that helped me the most as I moved into the business world. And I actually started out, I taught for a few years at the university, worked for a political consulting firm, which is, I guess, apropos given the season that we're in right now. Ran about 1,500 political campaigns for about 9 years, won about 90 some percent of them. Um, and then we started picking up corporate clients who would ask us to do marketing, advertising, PR, crisis management. And as I got into that, I just liked it better and sort of slowly gravitated away from the political side of things to the corporate side of things. Met the people at Electrolux, had an opportunity to do something in the corporate setting. And, I've been a consultant for 10 years, so I really hadn't had a boss, and I wasn't sure if that was going to work. I got there, I was there for about 6 weeks, and I said, I think I found a home. I love doing this, and I've never looked back.
That's great. So, if somebody was just starting out in their career and they were looking at manufacturing as where they wanted to go, or maybe they're launching a manufacturing company, what what advice would you give them?
Wow, I mean, entire books could be written about that. Manufacturing isn't as easy a path today as it used to be. And it isn't as obvious a path today because so many people are going into tech related fields and digital related fields. But at the end of the day, being able to make something and sell it is a good skill to have. And there are fewer and fewer people who do it well. Now, I happen to love working in a manufacturing environment. I love walking through factories, especially factories that I built, looking at the things we make, seeing them loaded on trucks and going out the door all over the world. But like anything else, it's good to have a focus and then be very good at what you do. And you have to feel passionate about it. I think you can sort of tell that I am passionate about what I do. So whether you're an engineer, whether you're in sales, whether you're in operations, if you're going into manufacturing, these are the things that need to excite you, as opposed to other sorts of things that you might find if you went into a high tech position. So, working with raw materials, working with machinery, learning the operational sides of things, because it's not only making things, but it's storing them and shipping them and supply chains and logistics. Sort of all the things that were the nightmares during the pandemic are things that my company at the time I was running a textile and wall covering company, we didn't suffer from because I felt pretty confident about how to manage supply chain because of the experience that I'd had. And we sort of sidestepped all those nightmares. So just be good at what you do, take it seriously, be passionate about it. And if you can't, maybe find something else because it's a tough world. Margins are not exotic in the manufacturing world. Sometimes pennies can make or break you. You have to be very good at it to be, well, if you want to be the best in the world. And like I said, I was lucky that I started with companies who were global leaders of world class companies. And that's sort of the standard that I've used throughout my career and what I try to bring to all the companies that I lead.
Well, thank you for that advice. So, what's next for you?
Well, I'm just about to launch something new. And we'll do it after Labor Day, but I've been working with some really smart tech guys, as it turns out,
So, a new
on a
direction.
not really, because I've always been able to leverage technology in the manufacturing things that I'm doing. And we're about to launch a new product. It's a sales technology product. And if you remember during the pandemic, it was so difficult if you were in sales to simply get in front of people, things that you never really thought twice about before. And as people have been a little bit slower and reluctant to go back to the office, and the whole nature of what for a company or working in the office means has changed. So I worked with some really smart guys. We've come up with a really groundbreaking new technology um, to sort of help people empower their sales teams to do more, communicate better. It will also help small companies who have small sales teams compete against the big behemoths. So look for this in about 3, 4 weeks time. But I'm really excited about it, and you'll see it in September.
Well, if you will send me the link with the information when you launch, I'd be happy to add it to the show notes at that time and share it on my LinkedIn because I have a lot of
Absolutely.
sales professionals that I'm connected to since that is our main niche for recruiting. So,
Well, and that's what I'm banking on is that just the network that I've developed over the years. People will see it when we launch it, sort of knock on the door, send me a note, and say, "Tell me more." And of course, we'll be anxious to do that.
well, you've definitely intrigued me. So I look forward to learning more about that. David, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. Is there anything else you want to share before we wrap up this episode?
Nothing special. It's just, first of all, thanks a lot for having me on. I've really enjoyed it. Um, just the manufacturing field in general may not seem as glamorous as some of the other things, but I've had just a terrific career in it. It sent me places I never would have gone. I've learned to do an entire range of things that I wouldn't have been able to do before and not get pigeonholed. So one of the things I like the most is in this field, I frequently get to sort of flex all the professional muscles that I've developed. I get to be in sales, I get to be in marketing, I get to build things, I get to design things. And if you like that sort of thing, this can be a really good career.
Mm. That's a great note to end on. So I appreciate that. And may we share your LinkedIn profile when we share this episode in case somebody just
Sure.
wants to message you and ask you a question? You've
Absolutely.
had an amazing work history in manufacturing, and some of our listeners and our followers are just starting off. So I'm sure they might like to look at you as a resource.
That'd be fine. I'd love to talk with them.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you to everyone who's been listening. I'm again Andrea Hoffer with Makers and Movers. If you like this episode and you want to hear more from manufacturing leaders, we'd really appreciate it if you would subscribe and share the podcast with others who might like it, or even just leave a review for us. You can find it on all the major podcast outlets. Thank you again, and have a great day.